Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. Okay, cool. So now we have found an event with a slavery event tied to a people who were taken to a land that is not theirs and were enslaved and oppressed for 400 years.
How long were the Israelites in Egypt? In Exodus 12:40 it says, "Now the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years." And so because of this, movies like the Ten Commandments will say things like this.
That's a hard dance you do, old man. We've been dancing it for 400 years.
400 years we have waited.
400 years in bondage. And today he won't move.
After 400 years of slavery.
And experts on the topic will say things like this.
The Israelites were there 430 years. We have the record in the Bible that tells about the Israelites going into Egypt and living there for 430 years.
But if you do the math, you'll find that this is not mathematically possible. You see, Moses was 80 years old when they left Egypt, his father Amram lived to 137, his father Kohath lived to 133, and Kohath was one of the 66 persons who went with Jacob down into Egypt. Now let's just stretch this out as much as we possibly can. Let's assume that Kohath was a newborn baby when he arrived in Egypt. Let's assume that Amram was born the year that his father died, and let's assume that Moses was born the year that his father died. So take 133 plus 137 plus 80, and that equals 350, which means that the amount of time the Israelites were in Egypt could have been no longer than 350 years maximum. Now, more than likely, Kohath was probably not a newborn baby when he arrived in Egypt. More than likely, Moses was not born the year that his father died, and more than likely, Amram was not born the year that his father died, which means that the amount of time the Israelites were in Egypt would have been significantly less than 350 years. So why does Exodus 12:40 say the Israelites were in Egypt for 430 years when this is not mathematically possible? The key is found in one of Paul's letters. In Galatians 3:16 and 17, Paul says, "Now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. And this I say, that the law, which was 430 years later, cannot annul the covenant that was confirmed before by God in Christ." Basically, Paul is saying that from the time that Abraham received the promise to the time that Moses received the law, there was 430 years. Well, Abraham received the promise when he entered Canaan when he was 75 years old. Then, 25 years later, when Abraham was 100 years old, that's when Isaac was born. Then, 60 years later, when Isaac was 60 years old, that's when Jacob was born. Then, 130 years later, when Jacob was 130 years old, that's when all of Israel arrived in Egypt. So take 25 plus 60 plus 130, and that equals 215, which means that there was 215 years from the time that Abraham entered Canaan to the time that all of Israel arrived in Egypt. Now, Moses received the law the same time that they left Egypt, because remember, the Israelites were living in Goshen, and then Moses led them out of Goshen, brought them through the wilderness, and brought them to the sea. And then God split the waters of the sea in half and brought them into Midian, which is in Arabia, then brought them to Mount Sinai, which is where Moses received the law. And so Moses received the law the same time they left Egypt. So Paul is saying that there was 430 years from this point to this point, and according to the Old Testament, there's 215 years from this point to this point. So take 430 years and then subtract 215 years, and that equals 215, which means that the amount of time that the Israelites were in Egypt was 215 years. 215 in Egypt, 215 in Canaan, 430 total. Now that is mathematically possible, because 215 is significantly less than 350, and that's exactly what the Greek Septuagint says in Exodus 12:40. It says, "And the sojourning of the children of Israel while they sojourn in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan was 430 years. The Samaritan Pentateuch says the same thing. It says, "Now the sojourning of the children of Israel and of their fathers, which they had dwelt in the land of Canaan and in Egypt, was 430 years.